Hello, welcome to the Address of Fear. If you love horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you're ready, let's get started. December 1968. The cold wind seeped into the rural roads of Northern California like an icy whisper, sending shivers down to the bone. The sky was adorned with millions of trembling stars, but for one couple, those stars were about to fade forever. In a desolate corner of Lake Herman Road, a blue Chevrolet sat under the dim glow of the parking lot lights. Inside, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were lost in each other's gaze, their laughter echoing softly in the night, their whispered conversations filled with youthful excitement, but they were unaware of one thing. In the darkness of the night, a shadow crept closer. The moonlight glinted off the cold metal of the heavy gun in the man's hand. His eyes were devoid of emotion, no anger, no thrill, just a sickening calm. David caught a faint reflection in the rear window. His pupils widened, and an unexplainable terror surged through him. Just as he reached for the door lock to step outside, he heard the chilling tap of a gun against the glass. A shadow emerged, maskless, yet as unknowable as the darkness itself. David's breath hitched in his throat, his words frozen in fear. He instinctively reached for his belt, but the killer was faster. The first gunshot shattered the silence of the night. The trigger was pulled, and David's head jerked to the side. His body trembled violently. The bullet had only grazed his skull, but the shock stunned him. Betty Lou let out a terrified scream and threw the door open, trying to escape, but Zodiac fired again. The bullet tore into David's head. His body slammed against the car door before slowly collapsing to the ground. His eyes remained open, yet void of any light. Betty Lou, paralyzed with fear, bolted into the darkness. The moonlight reflected off the wet asphalt beneath her desperate footsteps. Her breath was ragged, her chest tightened with terror. She heard footsteps behind her, steady, unhurried. Her legs threatened to give out, but she forced herself to keep running. For a moment, she thought she had a chance. 1, 2, 3. The rapid gunshots echoed through the still night. Betty Lou staggered as the bullets tore into her back. She struggled to take another step, but her legs gave way. She collapsed. Warm blood soaked into the cold earth beneath her. Her eyes gazed upward, toward the stars. And then, darkness. Zodiac stood still, his hands steady as he observed the lifeless bodies. He tilted his head slightly, his face devoid of remorse. This was nothing more than a ritual to him. Then, from the pocket of his coat, he pulled out a note. Carefully, with chilling precision, he took out a black ink pen and leaned over the paper. His handwriting was erratic, rushed, deliberately. So, it was part of his plan. This is just the beginning. Beneath it, scrawled in uneven, jittery letters, was a signature. I am Zodiac. He placed the note beside the bloodied corpses. Then, straightening his coat, he vanished into the night, leaving behind a parking lot soaked in blood, an unshakable nightmare, and a cipher that seemed impossible to solve. By morning, the flashing red and blue lights painted the sky as the police arrived at the scene. The detective stood in shock, staring at the drying blood on the asphalt, at the lifeless bodies with hollow, terror-stricken eyes. But what disturbed them most was the note left behind. Only hours after the murders, the editor of one of Northern California's biggest newspapers found an unusual letter in his mailbox, a chilling message written in shaky letters. Inside was a cryptic cipher, a puzzle of numbers and letters, seemingly meaningless. And beneath it, a familiar signature, I am Zodiac. This was not just a murder. This was the beginning of a riddle written in blood, and the terror was only just beginning. July 1969. A scorching summer night. The suffocating weight of the heat hung heavy in the Bay Area, merging with the endless symphony of cicadas in the deserted forests. The darkness of the night, barely pierced by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees, stretched over the silent waters of Lake Berryessa, and in those waters, the whispers of a killer awaited. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were, lying on the grass by the lake, gazing up at the stars. The world had stopped for them, or so they thought. But from the depths of the forest, a shadow was about to change their world forever. The footsteps approached silently. Cecilia lifted her head when she sensed movement in the bushes. A silhouette emerged from the trees, like a ghost gliding through the forest. Dressed in black with a strange mask covering his face, the figure had a large white symbol on his chest, a cross within a circle. Cecilia's heart began to race. Brian, still unaware, hadn't noticed the figure yet. But when she saw the gun in the man's hand, her breath caught in her throat. "What do you want?" Brian whispered, his voice trembling. The mysterious man didn't answer. He simply walked closer, pulling a rope from his pocket. When Cecilia opened her mouth to scream, the man suddenly leaned down and pinned her to the ground. He swiftly tied her hands and feet. Brian tried to move, but the man pressed the gun directly against his forehead. "Don't move." The voice was as cold as metal. There was no anger, no excitement, just the absolute reality of death. Brian and Cecilia, now bound and immobile, waited for what the killer would do next. But Zodiac set the gun down. Instead, he drew a long, shiny knife from his belt. The moonlight glinted off the cold metal of the blade. Brian wanted to say something, but Zodiac didn't even acknowledge him. He turned to Cecilia first. Slowly, he raised the knife. The first cut was shallow, but the pain spread through Cecilia's body like an electric shock. She tried to scream, but it felt as if her vocal cords were locked. The killer moved slowly, each slash seeming like part of a ritual, almost as if he was dancing with the knife. Then he turned to Brian. They locked eyes. Brian would never know what lay behind that mask, but the eyes. Those eyes were an endless void. The knife plunged into Brian's chest. 1, 2, 3. With each stab, Zodiac muttered something under his breath. Brian's eyes slowly began to close. The last thing Cecilia remembered was the pen the killer pulled from his pocket. He pressed his hand against Brian's shirt and began, writing with trembling letters, Zodiac. Then, he drew his symbol, the cross inside the circle. By the time the police arrived at the crime scene, Zodiac was long gone. But the message left behind showed that he wanted to leave a mark. As the detectives analyzed the symbol on Brian's shirt, they noticed something. The symbol resembled a pattern from the cipher Zodiac had previously sent. It was a map. But the map was incomplete. There was a missing piece, and Zodiac was preparing to complete it. Chapter 3. The Black Mask, September 1969. As the first winds of autumn swept through Northern California, the forest took on an eerie, unsettling calm. By the shores of Lake Berryessa, the gently rippling waters heralded the coming darkness. Brian and Cecilia, walking along the lake, smiled at each other in the fading light of day. But something was moving in the trees, stirring with the wind. Cecilia thought she heard a sound from behind. She shivered slightly and turned around. The forest was silent except for the rustling of the leaves. "Probably a squirrel," she said, smiling, and linked her arm through Brian's. But when she looked back, a shadow had appeared. Dressed in black, it silently approached them. A strange, square-shaped mask covered his face, and the mask's eye holes opened to a void of darkness. On his chest was a large white symbol, the cross inside a circle. When Brian first saw the figure, his entire body froze. His eyes widened, and his breath quickened. He screamed to Cecilia, "Run!" But it was already too late. Zodiac suddenly drew a gun from his pocket and aimed it at them. "Lie down," he said in a low voice. Brian carefully looked at Zodiac. He didn't know who this man was, but something inside him told him that this man brought death. Raising his hands in the air, he took a step back. Cecilia's hand was trembling. "Do you want money?" "Take it, my wallet is here," Brian whispered. But Zodiac didn't say anything. He took a thick rope from his pocket and slowly placed it on the ground. "Tie each other up," he said in a hoarse voice. Cecilia's eyes filled with fear. Brian hesitated, but when Zodiac took another step forward and pressed the gun directly to Cecilia's head, he reluctantly grabbed the rope. With trembling hands, he tied Cecilia's wrists. Zodiac nodded and then crouched down. He pulled something from inside his jacket. Brian and Cecilia held their breath. A knife. The first strike of the knife landed on Brian's back. His body stiffened, and a muffled groan escaped his mouth. Zodiac slowly pulled the knife out and stabbed again. Brian's vision blurred. His breath became shallow. Cecilia opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She was in shock. As her boyfriend's body slowly fell to the ground by the lake, Zodiac turned to her. He slowly leaned over and brought his mask close to her face. The mask was so close that Cecilia could see the dark emptiness behind the eye holes. "Your turn," Zodiac said, and the knife plunged into Cecilia's body. The pain started in her chest and spread through her whole body. She struggled to breathe. Her vision blurred and her consciousness began to fade. Zodiac continued to strike with patience, following a certain rhythm. When he landed the final blow, Cecilia's eyes were still open, but there was no life left in them. Zodiac reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick-tipped felt pen. He leaned over Brian's shirt and began to write in trembling letters, "Zodiac." Then he drew the symbol, a cross inside a circle. He straightened up, wiped the knife clean, and vanished into the darkness. That night, another letter arrived at a newspaper in the Bay Area. "Death is my playground, more will come," and Zodiac continued to disappear into the shadows. October 1969. The echoes of the Lake Berryessa murders were still fresh. As the police analyzed the messages left by Zodiac, fear grew with each passing day among the public. Ciphers, letters, threats. The killer moved like a chess master, pulling detectives into his bloody game. But this time, something went unnoticed. Far from the crime scene, across the lake on the opposite ridge, someone was standing. Hidden among the bushes at the top of a distant hill, a silhouette watched. That night, the person saw Zodiac don his mask, raise his knife, and the blood drip onto the ground. Someone knew who Zodiac was, but why wasn't that person speaking? His name was Ethan Carter, a 42-year-old nature photographer. That night he had gone up to a hilly area to photograph the sunset by the lake, but instead of pressing the shutter, his eyes were locked on the horrific scene unfolding at the lakeshore. What he saw from afar had burned into his mind like a nightmare. A man dressed in black, wearing a mask, knife strikes, muffled screams, and most importantly, that damn cross inside a circle symbol. Ethan couldn't move at that moment. His breath was cut off, his fingers trembled. He wanted to run, but his body betrayed him. When Zodiac wrote his message on Brian's shirt, Ethan made a mistake. His foot stepped on a dry twig. Crack! A small sound, but a deadly mistake. Zodiac suddenly lifted his head. The eyes behind the mask moved slowly from the bodies by the lakeshore, rising towards the hills. Ethan didn't make eye contact, but he felt it. He knew in that moment that Zodiac had noticed his presence. The shadowy silhouette slowly rose to its feet. Ethan held his breath and sank into the ground. He covered his mouth with his hands, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. Did Zodiac move? Had he ventured into the forest? He didn't know. The only thing he knew for sure was this: he was now one of the targets. For days, Ethan struggled with nightmares caused by the trauma he had experienced. He repeatedly sat down to talk to the police, but then always backed out. He knew. Zodiac was a shadow that killed without leaving a trace, but the newspapers wouldn't stop. One of the major news outlets reported that an independent investigator was preparing a file on Zodiac's murders. When Ethan read the article, a chill ran down his spine. The man mentioned in the article was him. Only a few hours after this news was published, Ethan found something at his door: a yellow, torn piece of paper. Written on it in trembling, irregular letters was a single sentence: "Those who keep secrets die silently." As Ethan held the paper, he realized his hands were sweating. His eyes fell on the small symbol beneath the sentence: the cross inside the circle. That night, Ethan fled from his home. The police never heard from him again, but Zodiac's pen was still soaked in blood. And for everyone getting closer to solving his secrets, the end was becoming a blood-written story. November 1969. The fall had fully settled over San Francisco, turning the city into a gray nightmare. The city was living under Zodiac's shadow, with new threats and new fears making headlines in the newspapers every day. The police worked day and night to decipher the letters and ciphers left by the killer, but every solution led to a new dead end. Zodiac wasn't just a killer, he was a ghost. He vanished into the shadows, seemingly slipping through reality itself. No one knew when or where they should search for him. The only thing they knew for certain was that Zodiac was watching them. And one night, one of the detectives felt it firsthand. Detective Michael Dawson was returning home late that night. He had spent hours at the investigation desk, analyzing Zodiac's ciphers, his eyes burning as he tried to make connections between the small letters. But there was no result. He lifted the collar of his coat and started walking down the street, the cold wind brushing against his skin. The moonlight illuminated the asphalt with a pale glow. The street was silent. Just as he reached for his keys. Tick, tick, tick. A footstep echoed behind him. Dawson stopped suddenly. His breath caught in his throat. His hand slowly moved to his gun. He turned his head slightly to look behind him, but the street was empty. Only the wind was dragging trash across the ground. But he had heard that sound. And worst of all, his gut told him that this sound wasn't a coincidence. He began walking, again, this time more alert. Tick, tick. He quickened his pace. His heart was pounding in his chest. Tick, tick, tick. The footsteps were accelerating. Someone was following him. Dawson suddenly spun around and raised his gun. "Who's there?" he shouted. But the street responded with nothing but its silence. Then, he saw a movement in the shadows. A shadow blended into the darkness at the end of the street and swiftly disappeared. Dawson's hairs stood on end. His palms were sweaty. In that moment, he realized Zodiac was after him. When he reached his house, he quickly opened the door and stepped inside. Trying to steady his heart, he took deep breaths. He stood by the window for a few minutes, watching outside. Then his eyes landed on the door. In the middle of the door, a yellow piece of paper was nailed down. Dawson's breath caught. He slowly pulled the paper off. His eyes scanned the trembling, irregular letters. "I'm very close to you. I can hear your breath." Beneath it, that cursed symbol was there. The cross inside the circle. The detective's blood froze. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Zodiac wasn't telling him how close he was. He was watching him. He could hear his breath. And maybe, even now, he was still watching from the shadows. Zodiac was never caught. His name continued to live on in the whispers of fear. The letters eventually stopped. The murders ceased. The threats quieted. But was that really the end? Or had Zodiac simply gone into waiting? Decades passed. People started to view his existence as a legend, an unsolved riddle. But the truth was, Zodiac had never really disappeared. He breathed in the shadows. And one day, he was brought back to life from a forgotten bookshelf. 93. San Francisco. The city seemed to have shaken off the shadows of old fears. A man named William Harris, a collector who enjoyed wandering through antique stores, was browsing the dimly lit shelves of an old bookstore that day. The scent of dust hung in the air. His fingers slowly brushed over the spines of books that carried the weight of years. Then, at the very back corner of the shelf, he noticed an almost forgotten notebook. The cover was worn. The edges seemed burned. Strangely, it stood apart from the other books. His curiosity got the better of him, and he pulled the notebook off the shelf, flipping through its pages. What he saw made his heart race. Inside, there were notes written in uneven letters, a familiar handwriting, a familiar darkness. Ciphers resembling Zodiac's letters, dates, murder details. But these had never been published anywhere before. Details of unknown murders. William's eyes widened. This couldn't be a joke. The writings here pointed to a terrifying truth. Zodiac might still be active. And then, he turned to the last page. In the middle of the paper, only one sentence was written. "The person reading this story, you're next." William's hands trembled. In that moment, he felt the air in the room change. The silence in the store felt like a tomb. He heard the faint creak of the door. He looked up. At the entrance of the shop, someone was standing, black coat, hands in pockets. His face was lost in the shadows. William watched the figure without blinking. A deep sense of dread settled over him. And in that moment, he understood. Zodiac had never disappeared. He was simply watching. And now the person he was watching was him.